Jim Jones was born on May 13, 1931, in Crete, Indiana. He was introduced to a religious lifestyle at a young age, as his mother was devout and frequently read the Bible. As a child, he was described as being obsessed with religion and death, which was unusual. In the 1950s, Jones began his career as a self-ordained Christian minister in Indianapolis. He was known for his charismatic preaching style and his advocacy for racial integration, which was a controversial stance at the time. In 1955, he founded the People's Temple, an integrated church that focused on helping the poor and the needy. The People's Temple grew rapidly, attracting hundreds of followers. Jones moved the church to Redwood Valley, California in 1965, and later to San Francisco in the 1970s. The church was known for its social services, such as providing food and housing for the poor, and its commitment to racial equality. However, behind the scenes, things were not as they seemed. Jones began to exert control over his followers, demanding absolute loyalty and obedience. He manipulated them with fear, telling them that the government was out to get them and that the end of the world was near. In the late 1970s, allegations of abuse and human rights violations within the People's Temple began to surface. Jones, feeling the pressure, led his followers to Guyana, South America, where they established a commune known as Jonestown. This story, my story, is based on the true events of Jonestown and the sinister man who led a group of lost souls. I was just a boy, no more than 10, when my family joined the People's Temple. We were simple folks from Indiana, my father a factory worker and my mother a seamstress. Life was hard, but it was all we knew. That was until we heard the magnetic voice of Jim Jones. Jones was a charismatic man, a preacher who promised a utopia, a paradise on earth. He was a beacon of hope in our dreary lives. My parents, like many others, were drawn to his message of equality, love, and communal living. They saw in him a chance for a better life, a better future for their children. And so we packed our meager belongings and followed him, first to California, and then to the promised land of Guyana. The first time I saw Jones, I remember being struck by his intense gaze. His eyes, a piercing blue, seemed to look right through you. He had a way of making you feel seen, understood. He spoke with such fervor, such conviction that you couldn't help but believe in his vision. "Brothers and sisters," he would say, his voice resonating through the makeshift church. "We are building a new world, a world where no child goes hungry, where every man and woman is equal, where love and peace reign supreme. Join us, and together we will create heaven on earth." The crowd would erupt in applause, their faces glowing with adoration. My parents were among them, their hands clapping, their eyes shining with hope. I remember feeling a sense of unease, a nagging doubt that I couldn't quite shake off. But I was just a boy, and what did I know? Life in the temple was different, to say the least. We lived in communal houses, shared everything we had. There was a sense of camaraderie, of belonging. But there was also a sense of fear, a constant undercurrent of tension that you could never quite escape. Jones was everywhere. His voice echoed through the loudspeakers, his words a constant reminder of our purpose, our mission. He spoke of love and unity, but his actions told a different story. He was a man of contradictions, a man who preached peace but ruled with an iron fist. One day, I remember my friend Billy being dragged to the learning room for questioning Jones's teachings. He came out hours later, his eyes vacant, his spirit broken. That was the day I realized that our paradise was nothing more than a prison, our Savior nothing more than a tyrant. But by then, it was too late. We were in too deep, too entangled in Jones's web of lies. Escape was not an option. We were in Jonestown, in the middle of the Guyanese jungle, miles away from civilization. We were trapped. As I lay in my bunk that night, the sounds of the jungle echoing around me, I couldn't shake off the feeling of dread that had settled in my stomach. Something was coming, something terrible. I could feel it in my bones. And then, in the dead of the night, I heard it. A scream, a blood-curdling scream that shattered the silence of the night. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. The scream was followed by another, and then another. Something was happening, something horrifying. I jumped out of my bunk and ran towards the source of the screams. As I rounded the corner, I froze. My blood turned to ice as I took in the sight before me. There, in the middle of the compound, was Jones, his face twisted in a maniacal grin, and at his feet lay a body, a lifeless, cold body. It was Billy. His body lay sprawled on the ground, his eyes wide open in a silent scream. The crowd around him was eerily silent, the only sound being the soft rustling of the wind through the trees. Jones stood over him, his face a mask of cold indifference. "Let this be a lesson to all of you," he said, his voice echoing through the silent night. "This is what happens when you question the temple. This is what happens when you question me." The crowd remained silent, their faces pale in the moonlight. I could see the fear in their eyes, the same fear that was coursing through my veins. We were all prisoners, trapped in a nightmare that we couldn't wake up from. The days that followed were a blur. Billy's death was ruled a suicide, a desperate act by a troubled soul. But we all knew the truth. We all knew what Jones was capable of. Life in the temple became a game of survival. We lived in constant fear, always looking over our shoulders, always watching our words. Jones's grip on us tightened, his rules becoming more and more oppressive. We were cut off from the outside world, our only source of information being Jones himself. He filled our heads with stories of chaos and destruction, of a world on the brink of collapse. He told us that we were the chosen ones, the only ones who would survive the impending apocalypse. But even as he spun his tales of doom and gloom, I couldn't help but notice the changes in him. He was becoming more erratic, more paranoid. He spoke of enemies lurking in the shadows, of traitors within our ranks. He was unraveling, and we were caught in his downward spiral. One day, as I was working in the fields, I saw a group of people being led to the learning room. Among them was my mother. My heart dropped to my stomach as I watched her being dragged away, her eyes meeting mine in a silent plea for help. That night, as I lay in my bunk, I made a decision. I couldn't stand by and watch as Jones destroyed everything I loved. I had to do something. I had to escape. The next few days were a whirlwind of planning and preparation. I knew that getting out of Jonestown wouldn't be easy, but I was ready to risk everything for a chance at freedom. And then, just as I was putting my plan into action, everything changed. Jones called for a meeting, his voice booming through the loudspeakers. He sounded different, more agitated. There was a sense of urgency in his voice that sent chills down my spine. As we gathered in the main hall, I could feel the tension in the air. Something was happening, something big. Jones stood at the podium, his eyes scanning the crowd, and then he spoke. "Brothers and sisters," he began, his voice shaking with emotion, "the time has come. The end is near." His eyes were wild, his face pale. He looked like a man possessed, a man on the edge of sanity. "The world outside is crumbling," he continued. "Wars, famine, disease, it's all coming to a head. But we are safe. We are the chosen ones. We will survive." His words hung in the air, a heavy silence enveloping the room. I looked around, my eyes meeting those of my fellow temple members. There was fear in their eyes, but also a strange kind of acceptance. They believed him. They believed in the end. But I knew better. I knew that this was just another one of Jones's manipulations, another one of his lies. The world wasn't ending. Our world was. Jones went on to speak about a final test, a test of our loyalty and faith. He spoke of a great journey, a journey to the other side. He spoke of death, but not as an end. To him, death was just a transition, a stepping stone to a better world. And then he revealed his plan. A mass suicide. A final act of defiance against a world that had rejected us. A journey to the promised land. The room was silent as he unveiled trays of small cups, each filled with a dark liquid. "This is our ticket to salvation," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "This is our destiny." I watched in horror as people started to line up, their faces a mix of fear and resignation. I watched as they took the cups, their hands shaking, their eyes filled with tears. I watched as they drank, their bodies convulsing, their screams echoing in the silent night. I knew I had to act. I knew I had to escape. But as I turned to leave, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned around to see my father, his face pale, his eyes filled with sorrow. "Son," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "it's time." "Time for what, Dad?" I asked, my voice trembling. I already knew the answer, but I needed to hear him say it. I needed him to confirm my worst fears. "It's time to join them," he said, his voice barely audible. He gestured towards the line of people waiting to drink the deadly concoction. "It's time to meet our destiny." I looked into his eyes, searching for some sign of doubt, some hint of hesitation. But all I saw was resignation, a deep-seated belief in Jones's twisted vision. "Dad, we can't do this," I pleaded. "This is madness. We need to leave now." But my words fell on deaf ears. My father was too far gone, too entangled in Jones's web of deceit. He was a lost cause. With a heavy heart, I turned away from him and made my way towards the edge of the compound. I could hear the screams behind me, the cries of agony as people succumbed to the poison. But I didn't look back. I couldn't. I ran through the jungle, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the sounds of pursuit behind me, the shouts of the temple guards, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. After what felt like an eternity, I emerged from the jungle and stumbled onto a dirt road. I was free, but at what cost? As I made my way towards civilization, I couldn't help but think about my family, about the people I had left behind. I thought about Jones and his twisted vision of paradise. I thought about the horror that was Jonestown. The world would soon learn about the tragedy that had unfolded in the Guyanese jungle. They would hear about the mass suicide, about the maniacal leader who had led his followers to their deaths. They would hear about the People's Temple and its deadly end, but they would never truly understand. They would never know the fear, the desperation, the blind faith that had led us to that fateful day. They would never know the true horror of Jonestown. And as I walked away from the nightmare that had been my life, I made a vow. I would tell our story. I would ensure that the world never forgot the horrors of Jonestown. I would ensure that the victims, my family, were never forgotten. And so, I write this as a testament to their memory, a warning to the world. For the allure of salvation can sometimes lead us down a dark path, a path that ends in destruction and despair. Let the tragedy of Jonestown serve as a reminder of the dangers of blind faith, of the power of manipulation. Let it serve as a reminder that sometimes the promised land is nothing more than a mirage, a deadly illusion that leads to nowhere.